Morning, everybody. Okay, I want to talk a little bit as people transition their homes from chametz to being prepared for Pesach. Some of the halachot of hechsher kelim, of hagala and libun. Most people at this point already have their own pots and pans and silverware that's designated for Pesach. Of course, there is some hagala, there is some kashering that still goes on, but many people really have separate sets already for Pesach. Therefore, I want to talk about today a little bit more are the things that are more permanent, that are harder to replace, and it's much less common for people to have replacement of these items for Pesach, which is basically anything non-movable, anything fixed. Countertops, ovens, stoves. Unless you have a Pesach kitchen, most likely you do have to use these items for Pesach. So let's talk a little bit about these more permanent type of items. In general, you have to know that there are some very basic and general guidelines when it comes to hagala, hechsher kelim, and libun. However, there are many exceptions, and the application of these halachot really can be quite detailed and complicated, and therefore one should not feel at all reluctant to pose any question you might have to a Talmid Chacham who is familiar with these halachot in general, before you try anything on your own. But in general, we say that if something is used with liquid, okay, it's wet, then that's the method that we require to also do the hechsher kelim. Okay, so if you use a pot by definition, when you're doing cooking, means there's water involved. So you're going to have to use method number one of hechsher kelim, which is to use boiling hot water. Okay, hagala means to submerge something in boiling hot water, kli rishon ala eish preferably, on the fire. While the pot is on the fire, you submerge it into a very large pot of boiling hot water. The second method is for dry heat. Imagine skewers. Person does the barbecue, then even though there's some juice from the meat or from the vegetables, whatever it is he's barbecuing, that's considered a dry heat, and therefore you need method number two, which is libun, of a very hot dry heat. Imagine a blowtorch, or when it comes to our discussion of ovens, a self-cleaning oven. Then you can use a dry heat. If a person has something which requires dry heat, like for example your skewers, then you're going to do a hechsher kelim on that. It does not work to do the other method. It's not just two options. You have to do the method which fits the usage of that item. So again, for skewers, for grates that go over a barbecue, right, the mangalka, you're going to have to do, if you put ever chametz directly on that, you cannot use the first option of the wet hechsher, of hagala, of submerging it into the hot pot of boiling water. You must use the method of dry heat. The method has to match. Sorry?
You need to have dry heat for the shikudim. They should put them on the back of the fire. That's it.
Good, that's fine.
There's no point of doing hagala when you're doing barbecue on Pesach. You put them on.
If it's absorbed from chametz before Pesach, then you have to kasher before you use it for your Pesach food.
You fire up the grill and you put them on the grill.
Good, perfect. Ideally, a person should use at least a heat of about 550.
Right, that's rule that we have.
Doesn't get hot enough. Right. So again, it has to be at least a heat of libun kal, at least 550 degrees.
Has to go right.
So, right. In other words, a point where it's red hot. That's the ideal. Or if it's you could burn, let's say, a piece of kash, a piece of straw on contact with that item. So if it doesn't get to that hot, then you have to use the more preferred method of blowtorch. A blowtorch gets it to be that hot. Okay. More ground rules. The item that you want to kasher has to be cleaned. Okay. You have to remove any chametz or any rust from the item before you do the hagala. If you're not going to, again, for the wet kashering. For the dry kashering, the libun, like we said, the dry heat, the blowtorch, it does not have to be fully clean because you're going to burn everything off of the surface, which is fine. But whenever you do hagala, then it has to be that the item was fully clean, and ideally that it was not used for the previous 24 hours. So don't use any chametz item for 24 hours before you do the hagala. Okay, another ground rule. How do you determine which method to use? Sometimes we use items in multiple ways. So this is the machloket Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. We go like the position of Maran, which is you go by the majority usage of that item. Okay, so Ashkenazim would say if at any point you used it in the other way, then you have to be concerned for that other method. So even if it's usually a wet item, but if I sometimes use it with dry heat, I'm going to have to upgrade the hechsher to the higher grade of dry heat, of libun. However, Maran goes with the opinion that you go by the majority usage. So back to some just practical cases. What is eligible? What material is eligible for hagala or for hechsher kelim? Countertops, what I'm talking about. No one's replacing a countertop. Can you use your countertop on Pesach? So if it's made out of stone, if it's made out of marble, then it's okay. A person has a metal, you have a stainless countertop, that's okay for Hagala. But the method is you heat up the Kli Rishon, you heat up water on the fire, and you pour it directly in the state of being hot over every area of the countertop. Once it cools off, you're going to have to maybe reheat the water a few times. But you heat the water while it's still hot, Kli Rishon, you pour it over every area of the stone countertop. If you have a formica countertop, there's a machlokes whether that works, this should be avoided. Okay, so clean the countertop off very, very well, and then you do Hagala on the countertop. Make sure again that it's a clean area and that it's a material which is eligible for Hagala. Wood, a person that has a butcher's block. People have different things in their kitchen. A butcher's block, wood is also eligible for Hagala. As long as you're sure that it's very, very clean. Any stubborn area, you clean it as well as possible and you spray it with something caustic or something which is a chemical. Then you could do the Hagala afterwards on that. Grates over a stove. Again, most people don't have a separate stove. So, Machlokes Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, the Ashkenazi poskim would say that the grates over your stove, if it's a gas stove, it has to be put into the oven and itself clean because that requires the dry heat method, the libun. However, Chazon Ovadia writes, based on the Achronim, that it's okay to do Hagala on the grates. Okay, so you can take your grates, you can stick them into a boiling pot of hot water while it's on the fire, Kli Rishon. There are some practical considerations. You have to make sure the nature of water is such that when you put something into boiling hot water, it cools the water down. So you have to be careful not to stick in, let's say, multiple grates, one after the other, if the water has become cool. Make sure the water is at a